In the tongue of the Eldar, it is known as Narn e Luinwe Telpalasa. Herein is set down a tale from the waning years of the Third Age, a time of lengthening shadows and fading light, when the memory of the last alliance had grown dim, and the might of Sauron, the great deceiver, stirred once more in the black land of Mordor. Yet, this is not a chronicle of the War of the Ring, but of a secret fire that burned in the north, and of a hope kindled in the heart of a maiden, a hope that, for a time, shone as brightly as the evening star. Chapter 1. The Whispers of Imladris. The wind, sharp and chill, swept down from the snow-clad peaks of the misty mountain, carrying with it the scent of pine and the murmur of ancient secrets. In the hidden valley of Rivendell, Elrond Half-Elven, master of lore and bearer of Vilya, the Ring of Air, looked out from his high balcony, his gaze fixed upon the eastern sky, where the first faint blush of dawn stained the clouds. A shadow lay upon his heart, a foreboding that had troubled his sleep for many nights. He turned as a tall figure, cloaked and travel-worn, entered the chamber. It was Thorongil, a chieftain of the Dunedain of the North, his face grim and his eyes holding the weariness of long league and sleepless nights. "What news from the Angle, Thorongil?" Elrond's voice was low, yet it resonated with the authority of ages. "The shadow deepens, my lord," Thorongil answered, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The orcs of Mount Gram grow bold, and their raids press ever closer to the hidden vale of Eredor. The people there, the keepers of the old ways, live in fear. They say the very stones weep." Elrond's brow furrowed. The people of Eredor were a remnant of the Eden of the First Age, skilled in the lore of the earth and the sky, and they guarded a secret that had been entrusted to their care since the days of Balerion's fall. "And the maiden?" Elrond asked, his voice softer still. "Elara? He is safe, for now, but the whispers have reached the ears of our enemy. A seer in Carn Dûm, a sorcerer of the fell arts, has spoken of a prophecy, that from the line of Luthien shall come a maiden with the power to command the very fires of the heaven, a power to rival the flame of Anor." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the sighing of the wind. The prophecy was an old one, known only to a few, a sliver of hope in a darkening world. But if it had reached the ears of the enemy, then the time for secrecy was at an end. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Carn Dûm. Far to the north, where the writ of Gondor did not run, and the memory of the Witch King of Angmar still lingered like a poison in the soil, lay the ruins of Carn Dûm. Within its crumbling walls, a new power had taken root. He was known as Malachor, a sorcerer who delved into the dark arts that Sauron had taught to the men of the East. From his high chamber in the Iron Tower, Malachor gazed into a basin of black water, its surface swirling with visions of fire and smoke. He had heard the whispers of the prophecy, and he coveted the power it foretold. With such a weapon, he could not only complete the work of his former master, the Witch King, but also challenge the might of the Dark Lord of Mordor himself. "The girl is the key," he hissed to the wraith-like figure that stood beside him, a lesser shade bound to his will. "Find her. Bring her to me. Her power will be my own, and with it, I shall forge a new dominion under a burning sky." The wraith bowed, its form dissolving into shadow, and sped forth from Carn Dûm, a messenger of darkness on a wind of despair. Chapter 3. A Glimmer of Hope in Eredor. The Vale of Eredor was a jewel of green hidden deep within the Angle, a land of rolling hills and ancient woods, watered by the clear streams that flowed down from the mountain. Here, the folk of Elara lived in peace, their lives ordered by the turning of the seasons and the wisdom of their elders. Elara was fair to look upon, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes that held the deep, clear gray of a mountain pool. But there was a fire within her, a power she could not yet command, that sometimes flickered in moments of great emotion, a spark of the ancient light of her foremothers. Her guardian, an old woman named Lyra, with eyes as wise and kind as they were weary, had begun to instruct her in the lore of her people, teaching her the names of the stars and the secrets of the earth. But of the prophecy she had spoken little, fearing to place such a heavy burden upon young shoulders. One evening, as twilight fell, and the first stars began to kindle in the darkening sky, a rider came to Eredor, his horse lathered and spent. It was Thorongil, his face etched with urgency. He brought a summons from Elrond of Rivendell. The time had come for Elara to leave her hidden home. The shadow was drawing near, and her only hope of safety lay in the last homely house. Chapter 4. The Flight to Rivendell. The journey to Rivendell was fraught with peril. Thorongil, ever watchful, led Elara and a small company of Dunedain rangers through hidden paths and over treacherous mountain passes. The shadow of Malakor's spies was ever at their heel, and more than once they had to fight their way through ambushes of orcs and other fell creatures that now roamed the wilderness of Eriador. During the long days and nights on the road, a bond began to form between the stern ranger and the young maiden. Thorongil, who had seen much of the world and its sorrows, found himself drawn to Elara's spirit, her courage in the face of fear, and the untamed power that he could sense simmering beneath her quiet demeanor. Elara, in turn, came to trust the grim Dunedain, finding in his steadfastness a rock to cling to in a world that had suddenly become a maelstrom of danger and uncertainty. One night, as they camped in the lee of a great rock, a storm broke over the mountain, a tempest of wind and rain and lightning. In the fury of the storm, Elara felt a strange resonance within her, a sense of kinship with the raw power of the sky. Unbidden, a spark of fire leaped from her fingertips, illuminating the darkness for a fleeting moment. Thorongil saw it, and in his eyes there was a mixture of awe and concern. The prophecy was true. The power of the burning sky was awakening. Chapter 5. The Council of Elrond. They came to Rivendell at last, weary and travel-stained, but their hearts were lifted by the sight of the hidden valley, a sanctuary of peace and beauty in a troubled world. Elrond welcomed them with grace and kindness, but his eyes were grave. A council was held in the Hall of Fire, and there, the full weight of the prophecy was revealed to Elara. She was, as the seers had foretold, the last scion of the line of Luthien Tinuviel, and she had inherited a measure of her ancestors' power, a power over the very elements of the world. It was a gift, but also a terrible burden, for in the hands of the enemy, it could become a weapon of devastating destruction. Gandalf the Grey, who had come to Rivendell upon hearing the tidings, spoke of Malakor and the growing darkness in the north. "This sorcerer is a servant of the great enemy," he said, his voice low and serious, "but he is also proud and ambitious. He seeks to build his own empire, and he believes that with the power of the prophecy, he can challenge even his master in Mordor." A plan was forged. Elara would remain in Rivendell, and under the tutelage of Elrond and Gandalf, she would learn to control her power, to use it not for destruction, but for the defense of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Thorongil and his rangers would return to the north, to watch the movements of Malakor, and to harry his forces, to keep the shadow at bay for as long as they could. Chapter 6. The Secret Fire. The days that followed were a time of learning and discovery for Elara. In the quiet gardens and libraries of Rivendell, she delved into the ancient lore of her people, and with the guidance of Elrond, she began to explore the depths of her own power. It was not an easy path. The fire within her was wild and untamed, and often it frightened her, but with patience and perseverance, she began to learn its rhythms, its ebb and flow. She discovered that her power was not one of brute force, but of harmony and balance. It was a song, the song of the burning sky, and she was its singer. As her skill grew, so too did her confidence. The timid girl who had fled from her home was blossoming into a woman of strength and purpose. Yet, her heart was often troubled, for her thoughts were ever with Thorongil and his rangers, who were fighting a lonely and desperate war in the wilds of the north. Chapter 7. The Siege of Amon Sul. The watchtower of Amon Sul, Weathertop, as it was known in the common tongue, stood as a lonely sentinel on the Great East Road. Here, Thorongil and his Dunedain had made their stand, a small island of defiance against the rising tide of Malakor's power. The siege was long and bitter. Hordes of orcs and evil men, driven by the will of the sorcerer of Carn Dûm, assailed the ancient fortress. Day after day, the Rangers fought with the courage of their Númenórean ancestors, but their numbers were few, and their strength was beginning to fail. Thorongil, his face grim and his arm weary from wielding his sword, knew that they could not hold out for much longer. He sent a swift messenger to Rivendell, a plea for aid, though he knew that the chances of it arriving in time were slim. Chapter 8. The Wrath of the Heavens. In Rivendell, Elara felt the desperation of Thorongil and his men as a sharp pang in her own heart. She went to Elrond, her eyes filled with a new and unshakable resolve. "I must go to them," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I can help them." Elrond looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not the fear of a young girl, but the fire of a queen. He knew that he could not deny her. With a small company of elven warriors, Elara rode forth from Rivendell, her heart a storm of hope and fear. They rode with the speed of the wind, and as they drew near to Weathertop, they saw the black banner of Malachor flying from its broken walls. The fortress had fallen, but the Dunedain had not been slain. They were trapped, surrounded on the slopes of the hill, fighting a last desperate battle. As the forces of Malachor closed in for the final slaughter, Elara raised her hands to the sky. A great light, as bright as the sun, erupted from her, and a wave of fire, a cleansing flame, swept over the orcish hordes, turning them to ash. The sky, which had been a leaden gray, was now aburn with a crimson fire, and in the heart of the flames, the men of the West saw the image of a great eagle, its wings outstretched. Chapter 9. A Pyrrhic Victory. The victory at Weathertop was a turning point. The power that Elara had unleashed had broken the back of Malachor's army and had sent a tremor of fear through the dark heart of Carn Dûm. But the price of victory had been high. The effort had left Elara drained and weak, and the sight of such destruction, even of her enemy, had shaken her to the core. Thorongil, his heart filled with a mixture of awe and a dawning dread, tended to her, his gentle touch a comfort to her weary spirit. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, they spoke of many things, of the future, and of the growing darkness that threatened to engulf the world. And in the flickering light of the campfire, a love that had been slowly blossoming between them finally came into full flower. Chapter Dex. The Shifting Allegiances. The defeat at Weathertop had not broken Malachor, but it had made him cautious. He had underestimated the girl's power, and he would not make that mistake again. He retreated to his fortress of Carn Dûm and began to weave a new and more subtle plan. He sent emissaries to the south, to the land of Mordor, bearing a message for the Dark Lord. He offered Sauron an alliance, a pact to crush the resistance in the north. In return for his aid, Malachor asked for only one thing: the girl. Sauron, from his dark throne in Barad-dûr, considered the offer. He had his own plans for the north, and he did not trust the ambitious sorcerer of Carn Dûm, but the power of the girl was a prize that he could not ignore. He agreed to the alliance and sent one of his most trusted servants, a Nazgul, to seal the pact. Chapter 20. The Betrayal. A shadow fell upon the hearts of the Dunedain in the days that followed. A sense of unease, of a new and more terrible threat, hung in the air. Thorongil, his brow furrowed with worry, doubled the guard and sent out scouts to watch the movements of the enemy. One of his most trusted captains, a man named Herion, whom he had known since boyhood, returned from a scouting mission with a strange tale. He had seen a great winged creature in the sky flying towards Carn Dûm, and he had seen something else, something that had chilled him to the bone. A lone rider, cloaked and hooded, meeting with a company of orcs in the dead of night. A terrible suspicion began to dawn in Thorongil's mind. He confronted Herion, and the man's guilt was plain to see in his eyes. He had been swayed by the promises of Malachor, promises of power and a lordship of his own in the new kingdom that the sorcerer would forge. He had betrayed them. He had revealed the location of their hidden refuge and the secret of Elara's growing love for Thorongil. And then came the twist of the knife, the venom in the wound. Herion confessed that he had not been acting alone. He had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game orchestrated by someone they had all trusted, someone who had been with them from the very beginning. With a heart as cold as ice, Thorongil realized the terrible truth. He turned his gaze not upon Herion, but upon the figure who had stood by his side through every battle, every hardship, the one who had guided Elara in her training, the one who had seemed a pillar of strength and wisdom. "Gandalf," Thorongil whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. But it was not Gandalf the Grey who stood before them. The benevolent facade fell away, revealing a being of ancient and terrible power, his eyes burning with a cold, white fire. It was Saruman the White, the chief of the Astari, who had long ago fallen to the lure of the Ring of Power and the shadow of Mordor. Saruman had known of the prophecy long before Malachor, and he had sought to control it for his own ends. He had manipulated them all, playing them against each other, with the ultimate goal of claiming Elara and her power for himself. Chapter 14: The Last Stand and the Fading Light. The final confrontation was not a clash of armies, but a battle of will. Saruman, his power now fully revealed, sought to break Elara's spirit, to bend her to his will. He showed her visions of a future of darkness and despair, a world ruled by the iron fist of Mordor, a world where her love for Thorongil would be her undoing. But Elara, though her heart was breaking with the pain of betrayal, refused to yield. She drew upon the deepest reserves of her power, not the fire of destruction, but the light of hope, the enduring strength of her love for her people and for the grim ranger who had stolen her heart. A great light, pure and white, erupted from her, a light that drove back the shadows and sent Saruman reeling. But the effort was too great. The power was too much for her mortal frame to bear. The light faded, and with a final whispered word of love for Thorongil, Elara fell, her spirit passing from the world of men. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Saruman, his plans in ruins and his treachery exposed, fled to his fortress of Isengard to await the inevitable wrath of the White Council. Malachor, his ambition thwarted, was eventually consumed by the growing power of his erstwhile master, Sauron. Thorongil, his heart shattered, took up the name Aragorn, and in the years that followed, he became a great leader of men, his sorrow forging him into the king he was always meant to be. He never forgot the maiden who had sacrificed herself for the love of him and for the hope of a world free from the shadow. And in the quiet moments, when the sky burned with the fiery colors of sunset, he would remember the song of the burning sky and the girl who had been its singer. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not in the way that anyone had foreseen. The fire had burned brightly, but all too briefly, a beacon of hope in a world on the brink of darkness, a light that would guide the men of the West in the long and bitter war that was to come. The lay of the Crimson Spire was ended, but the great tale of the War of the Ring was about to begin. Epilogue: The echo of a song. In the gray twilight that followed the flash of fading fire upon Weathertop, a silence fell deeper than any winter's snow. The wind that had for days carried the stench of orc and the clang of steel now whispered a low lament across the broken stones and the scorched earth. The surviving Dunedain, men hardened by long years in the wild, wept without shame, for they had witnessed the passing of a light that ought to have heralded a new dawn, but had instead been consumed by the very glory of its rising. Thorongil, for he was Thorongil still in that first rending grief, knelt beside the still form of Elara. Her face, in the calm of death, held a beauty that was now remote and terrible, like the memory of the light of the two trees of Valinor, a thing of legend that could never be again. He touched her hand, cold as the marble of a king's tomb, and the fire that had burned in his own heart seemed to turn to ice. The love that had been a newfound strength was now a wound that would never heal, a constant, aching reminder of what had been lost and what must now be defended in her name. He, who was the heir of Isildur, had found his queen and had lost her in the space of a single heartbeat. Upon that hill, hallowed by the blood of the kings of Arnor, and now consecrated anew by the sacrifice of the last daughter of Luthien's line, he made a vow, not of vengeance, for vengeance was a bitter draught that quenched no true thirst, but of unwavering purpose. He would walk the long, lonely path set before him, and he would not rest until the shadow that had stolen his light was driven from every corner of Middle-earth. When his men at last looked to him for guidance, they saw not the captain they had known, but a new gravity in his eyes, a king's sorrow and a king's resolve. It was there, amidst the ashes of victory, that Thorongil died, and Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elessar that was to be, set his face towards the long, bitter years of his inheritance. They bore Ilara's body back to Rivendell, a slow and solemn procession through the Trollshaws, now strangely quiet, as if the land itself mourned her passing. No orc dared cross their path, for a fear had been put into the dark things of the north, a memory of a fire that was not of smithy or of dragon, but of the heavens themselves. In the hidden valley, her bier was laid in the hall of fire, and the elves, who knew the long defeat, sang lamentations for her that echoed the songs they had once sung for Luthien herself. She was laid to rest in a green grove near the falls of the Bruinen, and a single white flower, Nifredil, grew upon her grave, and blossomed in all seasons, a pale and constant flame in the deepening gloom of the world. The tidings of Saruman's betrayal struck the heart of the White Council like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Elrond, his face a mask of ancient sorrow, had suspected the cooling of Saruman's heart, but not the depth of his treachery. But it was upon Gandalf the Grey that the burden fell most heavily. He had trusted Saruman, had looked to him as the head of his order, the one who should have been the chief bulwark against the rising tide of Sauron. Now he knew that the staff upon which he had leaned was rotten to the core. A council was held, though it was a council of shadow, for its chief member was now its greatest foe. Gandalf rode to Isengard, a lone grey pilgrim against the stark blackness of the Tower of Orthanc, seeking not battle but truth. The meeting was brief and bitter. Saruman, cloaked in his pride, did not deny his deed. He spoke of a new order, of a wisdom that could master the power of the enemy by wielding it. He offered Gandalf a place in his designs to share in the power that would come. "We can direct the storm," Saruman had said, his voice a mesmerizing symphony of reason and command. "Or we can be broken by it. There is a third way, Gandalf, beyond the despair of Elrond and the folly of the little folk. We can join with the power and guide it to our own ends." It was then that Gandalf perceived the full measure of his fall. Saruman's wisdom was gone, consumed by his lust for the ring and his fear of Sauron's victory. "There is only one Lord of the Ring," Gandalf had replied, his own voice low, but filled with the fire of his resolve. "And he does not share power." He departed from Isengard, a marked and hunted man, for he knew that Saruman would not suffer his defiance to go unanswered. The White Council was broken. The staff of the chief of the Astari was now bent to the service of evil, and the West was weaker for it. The watch upon Mordor had been betrayed from within. In the north, the fall of Malakor's host at Weathertop gave the lands of Eriador a brief respite, but it was a peace bought at a terrible price. The power of Carn Dûm was shattered, but the evil that had festered there was not extinguished. The Nazgul that had come to treat with Malakor returned to his master, and Sauron, learning of the maiden's power and her demise, turned his full attention to the greater game, the search for his lost ring. The remnants of Malakor's forces, leaderless and broken, were either scattered or crept back to the fell valleys of Angmar to be gathered in time by the summons of Mordor. The Dúnedain's long struggle did not end. It merely entered a new and more perilous chapter, for now they fought not against an ambitious sorcerer, but against the full and patient malice of the Dark Lord himself. Aragorn did not remain in Rivendell. The solace of that valley was a balm, but his wound was too deep for any elven medicine. He went back into the wild, a silent hunter, his grief a cloak that rendered him all but invisible. For long years he journeyed, and his deeds were many, though they were seldom sung or recorded in the annals of men. He rode in the host of the Rohirrim and fought for the steward of Gondor, always under the name of Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, for the memory of the Eagle of Fire that had heralded Elara's wrath was burned into his mind. He ventured far into the east and south, learning the ways of the enemies of his people, his senses ever honed, his sword ever ready. He became Strider, a grim and weather-beaten figure glimpsed at the edges of the wild, his true lineage known only to a few. He bore the weight of his heritage and the pain of his loss in equal measure. In the long watches of the night, under the cold and distant light of the stars that Elara had taught him to name, he would draw forth the ring of Barahir, the one token of his love for Arwen Undomiel, and he would be torn, for his heart had been given once and wholly to one who now walked beyond the circles of the world. Yet in Arwen, he saw the living embodiment of Luthien's beauty and grace, a choice between the fading light of the Eldar and the hope of the race of men. It was a choice he could not yet make, for his path was one of duty, and his heart was a house of ghosts. Years passed, turning into decades. The world darkened, the shadow of Mordor lengthened, and the whispers of the One Ring grew louder. The name of Saruman the White was still spoken with reverence by the foolish, but the wise knew him for what he was, a traitor who had built his own dark kingdom in the heart of the West. One evening, as the War of the Ring drew nigh, Aragorn stood once more upon the summit of Weathertop. The ruins were unchanged, a crown of broken stone against a sky of deepening purple. The wind sang the same sorrowful tune he remembered from that day. He looked east, towards the pass where the Nazgul would one day come, hunting for a hobbit and the burden he carried. He looked north, towards the empty lands where the kingdom of Arnor once stood, and he looked west, towards the sea and the memory of a light that had vanished. He was no longer the young chieftain who had led a desperate flight to Rivendell, nor the grief-stricken lover who had knelt in the ashes of his hope. He was the last heir of a long line of king, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by long years of lonely exile. The Song of the Burning Sky was over, its final tragic note long since faded into the mists of time. It would be a tale told only by the elves in the twilight of Middle-earth, a secret prelude to the great storm. Elara's sacrifice had not been in vain. It had saved the North from a swift and terrible doom. It had unmasked a great enemy in their midst, and it had kindled in the heart of the last king of Gondor an unquenchable fire. As the first stars appeared, remote and cold, he thought of her and of her gift. Her power was of the sky, a brilliant, consuming flame. His was of the earth, steadfast, patient, enduring. Her song had been a flash of lightning, illuminating the darkness for one glorious moment. His would be the long, slow journey of the sun, rising after the darkest night. He turned his back on the hill of his sorrow and set his face once more towards the road, his hand resting upon the hilt of the sword that had been broken. The time for reforging was at hand. The echo of her song would be his strength in the war to come. Epilogue, Part 2. The Long Watch. Years bled one into the next, and the seasons turned upon the wheel of the world, each seeming a little grayer than the one before. The green of Eriador remained, yet it was a green that held a deeper shadow, as if the memory of sunlight was growing thin. The sacrifice at Weathertop became a tale whispered by the rangers of the north around their hidden fires, a legend known as the Narn y Luinwe Telpalasa, the Lay of the Crimson Spire. It became a watchword for courage in the face of despair, a private legacy for the wandering folk who guarded the quiet lands of the Shire and the lost roads of Arnor. Elara's name was seldom spoken aloud, for it was too dear and held too much pain, but her spirit became the unseen heart of the Dunedain's long and thankless vigil. They were the guardians of a memory, the last remnants of a kingdom holding fast to the echo of a song. The power vacuum left by Malakor's fall did not remain for long. Evil abhors a void. Sauron, his designs ever patient and far-reaching, did not forget the northern land. From the thrice-despoiled fortress of Carn Dûm and the deeper, colder pits of Angmar, a new shadow crept forth. It was not the ambitious, self-serving evil of a mortal sorcerer, but something older, more methodical, and utterly bound to the will of the Black Land. Orcs, bred now not for a usurper's glory, but for the Great Eyes War, became more numerous and cunning. Trolls descended from the Etten Moors, their stony hearts filled with a malice not their own. And whispers spoke of darker things. Shades and wights stirred from their ancient slumber in the Barrow Downs, their cold hatred stoked by a distant command from the Lord of the Morgul Vale. To lead this northern resurgence, Sauron sent a lieutenant from the shadows of Dol Guldur, a wraith lord known only as Gorthor's Hand, a man of the East who in a former age had delved too deep into the arts of the enemy and had his spirit stretched thin and bound to the darkness. He was no Nazgul, but a being of lesser order, yet filled with a chilling purpose. His task was not to conquer, not yet, but to test the defenses of the North, to map the ruins of the past for their forgotten power, and to bleed the Dunedain, to wear them down, so that when the time for the Great War came, Eriador would be a soft and undefended land, ripe for ruin. It was in the dead of a fell winter, the year before the Fellowship would be forged in the fires of council, that this new threat made itself known. A company of rangers guarding the downs south of Bree went missing, and the last report from their captain spoke of a cold dread that did not belong to the land, a shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the stars. Aragorn, his face now lined with the cares of a hidden king, knew that this was no mere orc raid. This was a deliberate and intelligent evil. He gathered a company of his kinsmen, the hardiest of the Dunedain, among them Halbarad, his right hand, and a man in whom the blood of Númenor ran strong and true. Their hunt led them not towards the Etten Moors or Mount Graham, but to the cold and silent heart of the Barrow Downs, a place the rangers had long watched but seldom entered, for the memory of the evil that dwelt there was long and bitter. The enemy seeks more than just to slay us, Aragorn said to Halbarad as they made their camp in a hollow, shielded from the biting wind. The stars above were like chips of ice in a black sky. He seeks knowledge. The barrows of the Tarn Gorthad are filled with the bones of our forefathers, but also with the relics of the Witch King's conquest. Spells of ruin and containment were laid upon this place. If this new shadow learns to unravel them, he could unleash a plague of spirits upon all of Cardolan. Halbarad cleaned his sword by the low fire, his face grim. The barrows have been quiet for an age, my friend. What could stir them now? A will from without, Aragorn answered, his gaze distant. One that knows the ways of the unseen. We hunt a sorcerer, Halbarad, or something akin to it. For days they tracked their foe, finding signs of his passing, runes of power etched into ancient stone, their meaning dark and unsettling. The tracks of great wolves, larger than any living hound, and a spreading silence, a deadening of the air where not even the cry of a night bird could be heard. They found their lost kinsman at the foot of the Great Barrow, where the last prince of Cardolan was said to have been laid to rest. The rangers lay as if in sleep, but their faces were masks of terror, and their swords were still in their sheaths. No blade had touched them. Their spirits had been drained, consumed by a cold and ancient horror. As Aragorn knelt beside the bodies of his fallen men, a great weariness settled upon him. 40 years and more had passed since the fire on Weathertop. The faces of those he had lost were a gallery in his mind, a constant, silent company. He had fought in countless battles, had walked in the shadow of the mountains of terror, had seen the might of Mordor's legions in the east. Yet this quiet, creeping evil felt more personal, a defilement of his own land, his own past. The memory of Alara came to him then, as it often did in moments of great doubt. He remembered her fear turning to resolve, the untamed power in her that she had wrestled into a song of defiance. What would she have done? She would not have despaired. She would have faced the darkness and burned it away. His own power was of a different kind. He could not command the heavens, but he could command the will of men. He rose, his eyes once more clear and hard as flint. "They shall be avenged," he said, his voice low, but carrying with it the authority of his line. "This shadow will not claim the bones of our fathers. We will enter the barrow. We will face him in the dark." The entrance to the great barrow was a dark maw, exhaling a breath of profound cold, armed with torches and with blades forged in the west that held an enmity for the creatures of shadow. They descended into the earth. The air grew thick with dread and the weight of ages. Within the central chamber, lit by a sickening corpse light, they found him, Gorthor's hand. He was tall and gaunt, clad in black robes, his face a pale and bloodless canvas, from which two eyes burned with a cold, malevolent fire. He stood before the stone sarcophagus of the prince, his hands raised, chanting in a debased tongue that was an echo of the black speech of Mordor. Around him, spectral forms, the wights of the barrow, swirled like mist, their hollow eyes fixed on the Dunedain. "The heirs of the Sea Kings," the sorcerer hissed, his voice the sound of dry leaves skittering over stone. "You have come to join your ancestors in their endless sleep. Your watch is over. The North will be my masters again." The wights advanced, their chilling cries echoing in the enclosed space. The rangers formed a circle, their swords gleaming with a faint light. Aragorn strode forward, his face set. He began to chant in the pure tongue of the Eldar, a song of challenge and of light, naming the stars of the elder days and the power of Elbereth Gilthoniel. The light from his torch seemed to brighten, and the shades recoiled from the sound of the ancient words. But the sorcerer was not so easily daunted. He unleashed a wave of dark power, a tangible force of despair that sought to quench their courage and freeze their hearts. The torchlight flickered and died. The Dunedain faltered, the cold dread seeping into their bone. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, Aragorn felt the touch of that ancient fear, the fear of the dark and the things that dwell within it. For a moment, his own resolve wavered, and in that moment of despair, a memory rose unbidden, a vision as clear as if it were yesterday. Elara, standing on the slopes of Weathertop, her face turned to the storm-racked sky, not in fear, but in communion. He remembered the spark that had leaped from her fingers, a tiny star of defiance. He remembered the final blinding eruption of her power, a light born not of anger, but of love and sacrifice. It was a light that had driven back a shadow far greater than this. Her memory was a shield. The despair could not touch him. He drew the shards of Narsil, and even broken, they seemed to catch a phantom light in the gloom. "Elara," he whispered, a breath of a name in the suffocating dark. He cast aside the dead torch and spoke, his voice ringing with a power he did not know he possessed, the voice of Elendil's heir. "You have no dominion here, servant of shadows. This land is protected. You are trespassing on the graves of the kings of men, and they do not suffer your presence." As he spoke, he advanced, and behind him, his men, their courage rekindled by his own, raised their voices in a cry of defiance. The battle was joined, a desperate, swirling melee in the heart of the earth. It was a fight not just of steel against claw, but of will against will, of the living hope of the Dunedain against the deadening despair of Mordor. Halbarad fought at Aragorn's side, and together they carved a path through the spectral forms, their blades burning the wights with a white fire. Aragorn reached the sorcerer, and their wills clashed. Gorthor's hand was strong, his power rooted in the malice of his master. But Aragorn's will was his own, forged in loss, honed by duty, and anchored by a love that death itself could not extinguish. He felt a surge of strength, an echo of the song of the burning sky, and with a great cry, he struck. The shards of Narsil, a blade that had once cut the ring from Sauron's hand, now smote his servant. The sorcerer screamed, a high, thin sound that tore at the senses, and his form dissolved into a cloud of black shadows, which fled from the barrow and vanished into the night. With their master gone, the wights faded back into the cold stone, and a deep silence returned. They emerged from the barrow as the first hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky. They were weary to the bone, but they were victorious. They had faced the new shadow in the north and had driven it back. But Aragorn knew it was only a temporary victory. The hand had been a test, a probing finger of a much larger darkness. War was coming. It was no longer a matter of if, but when. As he stood on the cold down, watching the sun rise, a new resolve settled in his heart. The long watch was nearing its end. The years of wandering and waiting were over. Soon, he knew, a summons would come. Gandalf would have need of him. A quest would begin, a quest that would decide the fate of all. His path, which had for so long been a winding northern track, would lead him south at last, to Rivendell, and then to the very heart of the shadow. And the memory of the maiden who had set the sky ablaze would go with him, a secret fire to light his way through the coming darkness.